The moment didn't explode, it froze. Music stopped halfway through a laugh. Glasses paused inches from lips. 100 conversations died at once, all because the groom stepped forward, looked past his own family, past the marble columns and silk dresses, straight at the black man standing alone near the back of the room, and said, calmly, "Sorry I'm late, sir. Traffic was crazy then." After a beat, "Good to see you." "Boss." The word hit the room like a dropped plate. Boss, not friend, not uncle, not colleague. Boss, every face turned, every assumption cracked, because for the last 2 hours, this man had been treated like he didn't belong, like he was a mistake, like he should have known better than to show up. And now the groom, the man marrying into one of the wealthiest families in the state, was standing there with his hand out, waiting. Nobody moved, nobody breathed, and the family that had spent generations deciding who mattered was about to learn just how wrong they'd been. Kind of wrong that doesn't wash off, the kind that gets remembered, the kind that changes everything. 3 hours earlier, a black sedan rolled through iron gates trimmed so perfectly they looked fake. The place was Ridgewood Hall private estate, old money. The kind of venue where the flowers cost more than most people's rent, where the parking attendants were better suits than bank managers, where history wasn't just remembered but displayed like trophies in glass. Cases inside the car sat two men. One of them fit exactly where he was, Evan Whitmore, 41, tech founder. Family name stitched into law firms. Hospitals, donor walls, the kind of name that opened doors before he even knocked. He wore his confidence casually, like someone who'd never had to prove anything, never had to explain why he belonged, never had to justify his presence in any room. The man beside him did not fit anyone's expectations. Malcolm Reed, early 50s, black, calm eyes that had seen everything and chose not to react to most of it. Simple gray suit with soft wrinkles at the sleeves, no watch, no ring, shoes clean but worn, in the way that speaks of miles traveled. Not neglect, the kind of man people decide things about quickly. Too quickly, the kind of man whose story never gets asked, only assumed. "You sure you don't want to change?" Evan asked, half joking, but there was tension in his voice, the kind that comes from knowing what's ahead. Malcolm smiled faintly. This is fine, and it was because Malcolm Reid had learned something decades ago. That trying to dress for other people's comfort was exhausting, that authenticity outlasted performance, that the right people would see him regardless of what he wore, and the wrong people wouldn't see him even if he wore gold. Evan nodded, but his jaw tightened. He knew what was coming, had seen it before in boardrooms, at fundraisers, at family dinners where certain names were praised and certain people were questioned. Invited Malcolm deliberately, not to make a scene, but to make a point. The car stopped. They stepped out into afternoon sunlight that made everything look sharp and expensive. At the top of the stairs stood Evan's father, Charles Whitmore, tall, silver-haired posture, built from decades of being obeyed without question. The kind of man who measured people in seconds, who sorted the world into categories before coffee finished brewing, who believed his instincts were always correct because they'd never cost him anything. His eyes flicked past his son and stopped not. In curiosity and calculation, they moved over Malcolm, slowly, face, suit, shoes, hands. Posture, judgment, complete, verdict delivered silently, case closed. "And who is this?" Charles asked. The question wasn't friendly, it was procedural, the tone of someone confirming what they already decided. Malcolm extended his hand. "Malcolm Reed, I'm here with Evan." Charles didn't take Ive. Looked at the hand like it was a mistake, like Malcolm had misunderstood some unspoken rule, like the gesture itself was inappropriate. "With Evan," he repeated, amused. He laughed softly, the kind of laugh that's meant to be heard by others, the kind that invites them to join in dismissing someone, a guest. "Yes." Charles leaned in just enough for his voice to sharpen, just enough to make sure the staff heard, just enough to establish hierarchy. "The service entrance is around back." The words landed clean, practiced, like he'd said them before. Like this was muscle memory, like redirecting people was as natural as breathing. "You can wait with the drivers." Malcolm lowered his hand slowly, not in defeat, but in recognition. Evan's face flushed. "Dad, this is not the time." Charles cut in, his voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. "My daughter is getting married. I will not have distractions." The word distractions hung in the air, heavy with meaning, with everything unsaid. With decades of similar moments, a woman behind him, his wife smiled into her champagne glass. She'd seen this dance before, had probably participated in similar moments, had learned that silence was its own form of agreement. Phones appeared, whispers spread like smoke. Someone took a photo, someone else texted. The gossip network activated instantly because wealthy circles love three things: scandal, hierarchy, and the confirmation of their own assumptions. Malcolm stood still, not because he didn't feel it, but because he'd felt it before. In college, when professors assumed he was there on charity, and banks when loan officers processed his applications, differently in restaurants where hosts led him to certain tables. In stores where security followed him, learned that reacting gave them what they wanted, that anger confirmed their prejudice. That silence was sometimes the loudest response, and today, silence was strategic asterisk inside the hall. Malcolm became invisible and hypervisible at the same time. People looked past him, then looked again. Their eyes doing that thing where they try to solve a puzzle without asking questions. The hall itself was a cathedral to wealth, vaulted ceilings, crystal chandeliers that weighed more than cars, flowers arranged in patterns too perfect to be random, tables set with china that had never seen a microwave, silverware that had actual silver in it, everything designed to remind people where they were, who they were with, what they were part of, and who wasn't part of it. A woman in pearls approached, her smile tight. "And where are you from?" The question seemed innocent, but Malcolm knew the real question underneath, the one about origins and belonging. The one that assumed he must be from somewhere else, somewhere foreign, somewhere that explained his presence. Chicago? Malcolm said no, but originally Chicago. She blinked, recalculated, moved on. A man in navy blue with a flag pin asked if he worked with Evan. The way he said worked carried weight, carried assumption, carried the belief that there was only one kind of relationship possible. "We know each other professionally." Malcolm said, "Ah," the man nodded, satisfied, as if that explained everything, as if professionally meant subordinate. As if the hierarchy was now clear. Another suggested the bar staff might be hiring, said it with a laugh like it was a joke, but jokes reveal what people really think, and this one revealed volumes. Each interaction was wrapped in civility, every word sharp underneath. The kind of violence that doesn't leave marks. The kind that people can deny later, the kind that accumulates in small cuts until you're bleeding without knowing when it started. Security checked his invitation twice. The first time was procedure, the second time was suspicion. They looked at the invitation, then at him, then at the invitation again, like the paper itself must be wrong, like there must be some mistake in the system. The groom's aunt stared openly and whispered something that made her friends laugh. Their eyes darted toward Malcolm, then away, then back again. The universal language of gossip and judgment. Malcolm took water from a passing tray, clear head, clear memory. He needed to remember this, not for revenge, but for record. Because moments like this needed to be witnessed, needed to be remembered, needed to be evidence of what still happened. In rooms like this, he thought of his mother, Sarah Raid, how she cleaned offices at night so no one had to see her, so her son could go to school without knowing how much she sacrificed. How she'd scrubbed floors in buildings where people like the Whitmores worked. How she taught him that dignity was something you carried. Not something given, that respect was earned, but self-respect was chosen. "Don't let them make you small." She told him once, "You're already the size you need to be." She died before seeing him build his company, before seeing him become the thing. These people couldn't imagine, but he carried her with him everywhere, in every quiet moment, in every choice to not respond to provocation, in every decision to let his life speak louder than his words across the room. Evan watched it all happen, watched his family perform themselves, watched them execute the same patterns they'd executed for generations, watched them sort and categorize and dismiss, watched them be exactly who they'd always been, and for the first time, he saw it clearly, not through the fog of family loyalty, not through the excuse of tradition, not through the protection of "that's just how things are." He saw a cruelty, casual and confident, the kind that doesn't see itself as cruel because it's normal. This was why he brought Malcolm, not for revenge, for truth and truth. Once seen, doesn't go back to sleep. The afternoon moved forward, cocktails flowed, small talk circulated, people congratulated each other on being there, on being part of something, on belonging to the right circle. Malcolm stood near the back, not hiding, but observing, taking mental notes. Watching how power moves through rooms, how it decides who speaks and who listens, how it creates invisible walls between people standing 3 feet apart, then the doors open, music. Changed. The groom arrived. Daniel Brooks walked in smiling. Jacket half buttoned, tie crooked, the kind of entrance that said he'd been somewhere important. Doing something that mattered more than being on time. He was young, early 30s, good looking in an effortless way. The kind of confidence that comes from competence, not inheritance. He scanned the room looking for someone, then he saw Malcolm. His smile widened. Genuine, unguarded, the kind of reaction you can't fake. He crossed the floor fast, too fast for someone trying to maintain composure, too fast for someone aware. Of all the eyes watching, Charles Whitmore straightened, his face shifted. Something wasn't right. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. Daniel stopped in front of Malcolm, extended his hand. "Sorry I'm late," he said. "Traffic was crazy." Malcolm shook his hand. "You made it. That's what matters." Then Daniel said it, the word that would change everything. "Good to see you, boss." The silence was immediate, total, like someone had pulled the sound out of the room. Someone dropped a glass. The crash echoed. Nobody moved to clean it. Charles's face drained, not slowly, all at once, like someone had opened a valve. "Boss?" Someone echoed the word, barely a whisper, confused questioning. Recalibrating. Danny laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from not yet understanding what you've just done, not yet seeing the bomb you've detonated. "Oh, have you not met?" He turned, gestured, presented Malcolm like the answer to a question nobody had asked correctly. "This is Malcolm Reed. He owns the firm I work for." Pa's eyes widened. "He's also the reason I'm standing here today." Another pause. "4 years ago, I was drowning in debt from law school. Malcolm hired me as a junior associate when nobody else would take a chance." His voice grew stronger, more certain. "He mentored me, promoted me, trusted me with cases that built my career." Daniel looked at his bride, at her family, at Charles specifically. "Without him, I wouldn't be the man your daughter agreed to marry." Phones came out again, but now they weren't recording gossip. They were searching. Fingers moved frantically across screens. Names typed into search engines. Malcolm Reed. Reed and Associates. Malcolm Reed net worth. Results loaded. Numbers appeared. Big numbers. The kind that made people scroll to make sure they were reading correctly. Articles. Forbes mentions board appointments, acquisitions, philanthropic work. The man they'd dismissed as a driver, as help, as someone who didn't belong, was worth more than most of them combined. Malcolm Reed wasn't just successful, he was legendary in legal circles. A self-made attorney who'd built one of the most respected firms in the Midwest, who'd won cases that made headlines, who'd been courted by politicians and corporations, who sat on boards that decided things that mattered, and they'd told him to wait. With the drivers' faces changed, not all at once, but in waves, as information spread, as people checked their phones, as the truth replaced assumption, calculation replaced judgment, fear replaced confidence, regret replaced certainty. Charles's hand trembled slightly. He set down his glass carefully, like sudden movements might make things worse. His wife's face had gone pale. She wasn't smiling anymore, wasn't whispering, was calculating damage, social damage, professional damage, the kind that doesn't go away. The aunt who'd laughed earlier looked sick. The man with the flag pin studied his shoes. The woman in pearls had disappeared entirely. Malcolm didn't smile, he didn't glow, he didn't perform vindication. He simply stood there the same way he had before, same posture, same calm, same dignity, because the truth hadn't changed him, it had exposed them. Daniel's bride approached, Elena Whitmore, soon to be Brooks. She looked at Malcolm, then at her father, then back to Malcolm. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't know." Nobody asked. Malcolm replied, not unkindly, just factually. She nodded, understanding the indictment in those 2 words. Evan moved through the crowd, stood beside Malcolm. Solidarity without words. The photographer approached nervously. Do you want family photos?" Charles looked at Malcolm for the first time, really looked. Not calculating, not dismissing, just seeing a man who'd been there the whole time, asterisk. Charles left early, didn't say goodbye, didn't apologized, just collected his wife and walked out through the same doors. He'd used to direct Malcolm away. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The reception continued anyway. Weddings always do. The band played, dinner was served, speeches were made. But everything had shifted. People approached Malcolm, now apologized, made excuses, tried to explain. Tried to rewrite the last 3 hours. He was gracious to everyone because that's who he was. But he didn't forget, didn't pretend it hadn't happened, didn't make it easy for them, I understand. He said repeatedly, which wasn't the same as forgiving, but it was enough to keep the evening moving. Daniel gave his speech, thanked Malcolm publicly, called him not just a boss, but a mentor, a friend, someone who'd changed his life. The applause was loud, genuine, but also nervous because everyone knew what went unsaid, everyone knew what they'd witnessed. What they'd participated in. Elena cried during the speech, not happy tears, something more complicated. Shame mixed with gratitude, regret mixed with hope. She approached Malcolm later. Thank you for staying. She said, your husband matters to me. Malcolm replied, that's why I'm here. I want to do better. She said, my family, we need to do better? Then do better. Malcolm said simply, not because of today. Because it's right, she nodded, understanding. That this wasn't about her feelings, about her family's reputation. About making things comfortable again. It was about change, real change, the kind that comes from facing truth. Later that night, Evan found Malcolm outside on the terrace. The party continued behind them, muffled music and laughter, the sound of people trying to move past discomfort. I'm sorry, Evan said. Malcolm shook his head. You didn't do this, but I invited you, and they revealed themselves. Evan leaned against the railing. I wanted them to see, but I didn't think. You didn't think it would be that bad? Yeah, Malcolm was quiet for a moment. It's always that bad. He said finally, you just don't usually see it. How do you live with it? You don't live with it, Malcolm said. You live through it. There's a difference. They stood in silence below them. The lawn glowed under soft lights, perfection maintained. Even as everything else crumbled, my mother would have laughed. Malcolm said, not because it's funny, because she survived worse. I want to be better. Evan said asterisk, then be better. Malcolm replied, use what you saw today, use your access. Your name, your privilege. You looked at Evan directly. You saw how your family treats people they think don't matter. Now you can't unsee it. Evan nodded. What do I do? You already know. Malcolm said, you just have to decide if you're brave enough to do it. Asterisk months later. The story would circulate quietly, not as gossip, as warning, the kind of story people told to teach lessons. To remind others to look twice, to question assumptions. To remember that dignity doesn't wear a price tag. The Whitmore family changed not overnight, not completely, but measurably. They funded scholarships, opened their club to new members, revisited policies that had existed for decades without examination, not because they'd suddenly become enlightened, but because they'd been embarrassed. Publicly, permanently, and sometimes shame is the first step toward growth. The club changed its policies, membership requirements were rewritten, selection committees were diversified. The old guard complained, but quietly because nobody wanted to be the next Storia scholarship. Malcolm funded went to a Whitmore cousin blind selection. Pure merit, no names, no connections, just grades and essays and potential. The cousin was brilliant, earned every opportunity, but also learned something her family needed to learn, that merit isn't about who you know. It's about what you do. Irony without cruelty. Malcolm went back to his life asterisk. Still wore the same gray suit, still drove himself, still walked through front doors without explaining why he belonged, because he'd learned long ago that belonging isn't given, it's claimed, not through force, but through presence, through persistence, through refusing to accept other people's limitations. His firm grew, more diverse hires, more mentorship programs, more opportunities for people who looked like him. For people who'd been told they didn't belong, because representation matters. Not as performance, but as proof that doors can open, that rooms can change, that power can be shared. Daniel Brooks became a partner. Not because of the wedding, but because he'd earned it. Because Malcolm saw what Charles Whitmore couldn't potential beyond pedigree, value beyond name, worth beyond assumptions. They worked together for years, built cases that mattered, changed laws that needed changing, created opportunities that hadn't existed. Elena Whitmore Brooks started a foundation focused on access to legal services, on breaking down barriers, on creating pathways for people who'd been locked out. Their father never joined the board asterisk, but he donated quietly, maybe to ease conscience, maybe to repair reputation, maybe because something had actually changed. Nobody asked why the money helped regardless. Years past, Malcolm Reed became the kind of name that opened doors, that got return calls, that commanded respect, not because he'd changed, but because he'd remained himself until the world caught up. He gave speeches sometimes at law schools, at conferences, at events where young people needed to hear that dignity isn't negotiable, that worth isn't assigned by others, that silence can be powerful when wielded correctly. They'll try to tell you where you belong. He'd say they'll make assumptions about who you are. They'll treat you like you're invisible or like you're too visible. Both at the same time, but here's what I learned. He'd pause, look at faces, young faces, brown faces, black faces. Faces that needed to hear this. Your value doesn't change based on who sees it. The man who directed me to the service entrance didn't make me less. The people who whispered didn't diminish me. The assumptions didn't define me, because I knew who I was before I walked into that room, and I knew who I was when I walked out. Another pause. They revealed themselves. I revealed nothing, because there was nothing to hide. Applause every time, not because the story had a happy ending, but because it had a true one. The story spread. Malcolm Reed at the wedding, Malcolm Reed and the Whitmores, Malcolm Reed, and the moment everything changed, it became shorthand. A reference point, a reminder of how wealth doesn't equal wisdom, how assumptions don't equal truth, how the person you dismiss might be the one you need most. Charles Whitmore eventually reached out 5 years later through intermediaries, carefully worded messages. He wanted to apologize, to explain, to make amends. Malcolm met him, not because he was obligated, but because closure mattered, because growth deserved acknowledgement. Even if it came late, they met at a neutral location, a quiet restaurant, no audience, no witnesses. Charles was older, smaller somehow. The confidence reduced, the certainty cracked. I was wrong. He said simple words, hard to say. Malcolm nodded. Yes, I want you to know. I know. Malcolm interrupted gently. You were taught to see the world a certain way. We all were. That doesn't excuse it. No. Malcolm agreed. It doesn't. But it explains it. Charles looked at his hands. How do you move past this? You don't move past it. Malcolm said, you move forward with it. You remember what you did. You acknowledge the harm. You do better going forward, and you accept that some people won't forgive you. Because forgiveness isn't required. Charles nodded slowly. They didn't become friends, didn't have some Hollywood reconciliation, but they had truth and understanding and acknowledgement, which was more than most people get. Malcolm walked out of that restaurant thinking of his mother again, Sarah Reed, who'd worked overnight shifts, who'd sacrificed everything, who taught him to stand tall. Even when the world wanted him bent, don't let them make you small. She said he never had and he never would, because the value of a person isn't revealed by how they treat power, it's revealed by how they treat someone they believe has none, and sometimes the man you dismiss at the door is the one holding the keys to your future, not just metaphorically, but literally the keys to opportunity, to success, to redemption, to change. Malcolm Reed carried those keys, not because he was perfect, but because he was present, not because he was powerful, but because he was persistent, not because he demanded respect, but because he embodied dignity. And in the end, that's what mattered, not the moment of exposure, but the lifetime of character that made the moment possible. Not the shock on their faces, but the steadiness in his, not the apology that came late, but the integrity that never wavered. That's the story, not of revenge, but of revelation, not of anger, but of awareness, not of making them pay, but of making them see. And once they truly saw, everything changed, not because Malcolm demanded it, but because truth has weight, and weight shifts everything. The man they thought didn't belonged all along. He just didn't need their permission to know it. And that more than anything was what changed the room that day at the wedding and every day after.